Hello, everyone. Welcome to the third webinar that we've done on AI and writing, parentheses, instruction, because we sort of do some instructional bits and spend a lot of time talking about writing. I'm Jeff Grabill. I'm the Deputy Vice Chancellor for Student Education here at the University of the Leeds in the UK. And in Leeds, it gets pitch black about 3:45 in the afternoon these days, which sends everybody into a depression or a pub or both. So this is a happy diversion for me, particularly because I get to talk. Sid, we haven't really had a conversation in ages, so we're going to have a conversation today with Sid Dobrin from the University of Florida, who has been working in the domain of writing and technology forever. And and what we'll do here, I'm going to turn it over to Sid, let him introduce himself a little bit, and then I'm going to ask you a prompt to sort of get you started, let you talk for a little bit, and then I'm going to ask you some questions, and then we have some attendees and they'll ask us some questions and we'll close it off around the hour mark if that's okay with you. You comfortable with that, Sid?
Sounds great to me. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with y'all.
So Sid, I fully expect you at some point in time talk a little fishing with us. So
If you'd like,
yeah.
I've
So,
actually just launched a AI strategy company for the recreational fishing industry, so I can talk AI and fishing in the same sentence.
Sid, you just made me the happiest man in the world. I figured you'd put those two things together and you have, haven't you?
Yes, I have.
All right. So let's just go, Sid. Let me give you a chance to introduce yourself. Tell the audience a little bit about who you are. We might tend to have had a little bit of an international audience for this, and so some grounding in that context would be good. And I'll give you your prompt. So introduce yourself, and go with your first prompt, if you will. I mean, and the prompt is really simple. You've been writing an awful lot. You've got a couple of books around AI and writing. And so introduce yourself and then walk us through a little bit of what are the key arguments and themes that you're working through in the books that you're writing and the work that you're doing. Fair enough?
Fair enough. It's a big question, but I think we can hone it in.
I think
So
you could.
thanks, Jeff. Thanks for the opportunity. As Jeff said, I am Sid Dobrin. I am the chair of the Department of English at the University of Florida. I have been chair now for 10 years, and I'm stepping out of the chair position in August, primarily.
Congratulations.
Thank you, thank you. Primarily because I am working on two big AI projects that I want to be able to dedicate more time to. As Jeff suggested, I've been working with emerging technologies and writing for most of my career. I started working with AI several years before the OpenAI drop of ChatGPT. Since that time, since the OpenAI drop, I've had the opportunity to visit about 70 campuses worldwide to work with faculty and administrators in thinking about AI deployment on their campuses. In addition to teaching and working in the Department of English, I am also faculty with the Florida Institute of National Security, which is part of UF's AI initiative. And I do need to mention that initiative because just, I guess, about 5 years ago, so before COVID, University of Florida kicked off an AI initiative primarily because one of our alums happens to be the CEO of NVIDIA and
Mhm.
donated about $20 million toward taking our Hypergator supercomputer and making it the fastest academic supercomputer in the world. And then UF dumped another 50 million, I think it was, on top of that. We have since then hired over 300 faculty working strictly in AI. We have an AI QEP for all curriculum across the university. And we have about 12,000 students working in AI areas right now, and that is continually growing. As of yesterday, the university kicked off the AI Blue Sky Task Force that involves about 15 of us who are starting to look at much larger scope moving ahead of how to keep UF ahead of the AI curve. There are actually jokes that we are rebranding as the AI University. Uh, so
Are
it,
you?
yeah, I think we are becoming it in a lot of ways. Um, One of the great things that has, these last 2 years, having been on all of these campuses and worked with faculty and administrators and CIOs and IT people is really getting a sense of how AI is being integrated around the world, specifically across the US, across Australia, Southeast Asia, and really getting a sense of where faculty and students are. I attended a conference, gave a talk day before yesterday at the AI at Notre Dame conference with CIOs and IT people from around the country, really just to start to get a better sense of what the attitudes are about AI around the country. And so when you ask what are the big issues, I think that right now, the two primary issues that most people are talking about are faculty development. That is a huge issue because faculty, while feel this sort of pressure to integrate AI and Gen AI technologies into their pedagogies, there's not a lot of support or resources at most places for doing that, particularly at places that don't have research initiatives in their mission. You look, for instance, at a small 2-year school that focuses on vocational work, and it's very difficult for faculty development to move in that direction. And what that lends to also then is a large kind of sense of that notion of imposter syndrome, of how am I supposed to teach these technologies when I myself don't really know much about them. So one of the things that I've been focused on with faculty is just a basic process of demystifying what AI and Gen Tech technologies are, how they work, and then talking about the bigger conceptual questions of what does it mean when we integrate these things into our pedagogies and into our research. So really right now, in answer to the direct question, Jeff, about what are the big issues, faculty development is really at the top of that list. And then if we subset down, we can see that a lot of the questions then become more sort of nitty gritty, and these things have evolved. So during the first year after the ChatGPT drop, of course, academic integrity was the big question. That has sort of waned a little bit as more and more people recognize that these tools aren't necessarily being used in the ways that they had imagined them being used, as sort of the cheater's tool, where the tools are just doing the work for the student or for the researcher. And I think part of the reason that that has happened, and we can actually look at the usage numbers from OpenAI. The United States has the largest number of users of ChatGPT in the world, but over the last 6 months or so, that percentage has dropped. And I think there's a reason for that. The first is that ChatGPT was never designed for higher ed. And as we're seeing now, about 1,000 new Gen AI platforms are being launched each week. And these are now being launched as disciplinary specific with proprietary LLMs. They're much more trustworthy, and they're designed for specific industries. Well, we're starting to see that happen in higher ed now too. So a lot of our concerns about things like academic integrity are actually being answered in the platforms that are being designed for higher ed. So we're getting integrity guardrails that, you're not going to be able to, I could go to ChatGPT and just type in, write an essay about Moby Dick. And of course, that's a lousy prompt, so I'm going to get a lousy answer, but it will give me an answer. With some of the platforms that are designed specifically for higher ed, and I don't shill for any of them, so I'm going to avoid doing lots of naming of platforms. But with a lot of the new higher ed platforms, if I type in, write an essay about Moby Dick, it will come back with a response along the lines of, this sounds like a violation of academic integrity. Let's talk about what the prompt is and what a research plan might be. So from a faculty perspective, a curricular development perspective, a teaching perspective, faculty development is where a lot of that focus has to come into play. And finding the resources for doing that has been one of the primary things that we have to talk about. I don't know if you want me to keep going through subjects, otherwise we'll be here all day, but
yeah, well, let me prompt you. Let me treat you like a generative intelligence and prompt you a little bit. But before I do that, just a reminder to the participants: if you go ahead and use the Q&A tool. Eventually, I'll read it and I'll ask Sid some questions. We'll make Sid read it and answer them at the same time. I'll manage that for us. But as you have questions, go ahead and pop them in. And as soon as we have some questions, I will happily move from my questions. I have a ton of them. I'll happily move from my questions to yours as we see them. But so Sid, a little bit. I mean, you went there. You've already started to answer it, but you've been traveling around you just mentioned you at Notre Dame, whether you're traveling physically or virtually. I think you're doing a little bit of both. You've been doing a lot of traveling.
Yes.
And so when you visit at different kinds of campuses, different kinds of academic communities, could you tell us a little bit more about what you're hearing from those you speak with in terms of both their concerns and certainly the possibilities? I mean, academic integrity is, let's take that as a given. And we'll come back to professional development. Outside of those two, what are you hearing when you speak with people around the country?
Yeah. So what I've been hearing more recently has been a change over the last year or so from what I first heard. Initially, we have no idea what these technologies are, and there was a lot of resistance. And I have to admit, the largest resistance that I've encountered has come from writing faculty and art faculty. And writing faculty, while still resistant to a degree, are becoming more, I won't say advocates, but more understanding of the potentials of what these tools can do. One of the things that I think I've seen in the last 6 months is that more and more places are looking for use case scenarios so that they have a better way of thinking about what are we actually going to do on our campus. So during the first, let's say, year after the OpenAI drop, most of the campuses I visited were the atmosphere was either complete resistance, you're the harbinger of doom, don't come here and tell us how to use these, this is going to destroy a higher education. But I think as things have shifted, that more and more faculty and more particularly administrators are asking, what can we actually do on our campus? And so there's a lot of requests for use case scenarios. There's also a lot of conversation about what platforms are people using. This is an interesting conversation simply because finding platforms that will work across disciplines is very difficult. And because when we talk about Gen AI deployment, or any AI deployment for that matter, these are such contextually specific questions that an institution can't institute a platform or a policy across the board, because what engineering is doing is going to be different than what pharmacy or history or English or writing or whatever it happens to be is going to be very different. And then even within those disciplinary divisions, what one writing teacher does and wants to accomplish is going to be very different from what another writing teacher wants to do, even if they're teaching this different sections of the same course. So there's a lot of conversation about how do you develop best practices and policy when this is so contextual. For me, the other interesting part of the question is also embedded in all of this. All of the AI and all of the Gen AI have put us in the position of having to ask some serious questions of what I'm thinking of as our legacy epistemologies about higher ed. Because a lot of the resistance that we see to these technologies are grounded in kind of a very staunch belief in what we do, and whether that's, the research shows this is effective teaching method, but it really puts into that spotlight, is this context so different that we do have to start questioning what we do in higher ed? And it asks us to really rethink our epistemologies and philosophies about higher education. And once you start having that conversation, where that leads, and the thing that I find most interesting is having that conversation between the notion of how will these tools help us do better at what we've always done, paired up against how will these tools let us do things we haven't yet imagined. And so when we start having that kind of a question, now we can ask questions like, well, let's go back to those fundamental questions about what is the function of writing, and then how are we teaching writing? Because if we tie this into Ret Comp history, then there's a lot of questions about the writing process, about post process, about agency, subjectivity. All these questions come to the fore, and that doesn't mean that these technologies are suddenly upending this. It's that they're shining a light, saying we got to think about this.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, yeah. So I want to come back to the larger conceptual questions because, the work that Bill and I were doing for years, and we used to argue that machines write, and people used to tell us we were crazy. And Bill was particularly bold on this. But those chickens have come home to roost, and they do. We are really getting into a place where we can start thinking about, seriously machine augmented human creativity and intellectual work. And there are some really interesting questions there. But let's not go there just yet because
Okay.
yes, we have some really good questions from the people who've joined us today that are better versions of the questions I was going to ask you too. So I want to start. Let's come. We'll come back around to that, I think. But very specific question from someone who's experimenting in their writing classes and getting some resistance from students to using these tools. So as you travel around, are you seeing student resistance, and are there strategies that you've seen people use for getting students to overcome that resistance?
Yeah,
Or is it a
absolutely.
good idea to get them to overcome the resistance?
Yeah, absolutely seeing the resistance. And what's interesting is that has also evolved. So when I started, after the OpenAI drop, and I started working on campuses, when we would involve students in the workshops or in the meetings, and we would ask, how many of you have used ChatGPT? I might as well have asked how many of you have used Molly, because they all do the head down, don't want to make eye contact, look around the room as though I've just asked whether they've committed sin in the classroom. Now there's a lot of resistance, but where that resistance, at least where I think this resistance is coming from, is because we built up such a solid narrative about this being cheating, about the academic integrity issue, that a lot of the students are afraid that if they use this, they're going to get dinged for it. And in fact, I don't know if you saw a couple of months ago in the news, the student at University of North Georgia, which is a campus that provides a generative AI platform, pays a licensing fee, and encourages their students to use it. Student used it as directed, and the faculty member charged this student with plagiarism.
Hmm.
And it was a big conflict of, wait a minute, the university policy is you can use these tools, we're providing you these tools. And then it came back because one of the faculty members said, no, you're not doing that in my classroom. So a lot of the resistance comes from sort of two areas, at least in what I'm seeing. The first is reaction to the narrative that we created early on about these tools being cheaters' tools and violating academic integrity. The other resistance that we see are from those students who thoroughly embrace the idea of what education is for and identify, I don't want to do this, I want to do it myself. And I'm seeing a lot of that. And for me, those are sort of positions that become too foundational. They're not. Once you talk to the student about what do you mean you don't want the machine to do it for you, but once again, when we start demystifying the technologies, then there's a better sense of, oh, I see where this can be used. I also think there's a big misconception among most of the faculty that I work with of what your students are actually doing with these tools. Very few students, and we can look at. I've got plenty of data about this too, that students aren't just giving prompts of do my homework for me. They're asking it for advice. What are some ideas about what this essay ought to be about? What are some key points? Will asking it for revision comments? Great human machine collaboration on peer revision. I talk a lot about peer revision in AI because we all know, when we require peer revision in our classes, and the student asks their roommate or their mom or whomever, hey, could you take a look at this essay? And the response is, oh, it's okay. Well, the AI is actually going to give you a different kind of more thorough response. So yeah, definitely seeing response that are resistant from students, but almost along that same curve pattern. As more and more faculty are integrating, more and more students are starting to figure out the right ways to use these tools.
Yeah. Well, and I can't resist, Sid, you're going to have to forgive me for this, but peer review is better if you use Eli review. So,
I told you I'm not shilling. You know?
so let's stay here a little bit with resist. I mean, so I've got another resistance question from the people who've joined us. But when students look at their shoes, do you believe them when they say that they're not using it? Because we're seeing data here at Leeds where students are using it at exceptionally high levels. Is that what do you think about
students
that?
are students are using it at a much higher level than faculty are.
Yeah,
Uh, I love this question from Carolyn Wilkins, though.
I was just going to go
Yeah,
there. Go ahead,
right.
do that.
Yeah. I really appreciate that question simply because in every single talk that I give, when I'm talking about the demystification of these technologies, one of the things that I point out is I'll talk about the conceptual and I'll talk about the application, but the thing I wish I could talk more about is the material consequences of the use of these technologies. And I do a little spiel about the cradle to grave, everything from mineral extraction, conflict minerals in Congo to e-waste in the global south. For me, and now I'll tie it back into your joking about the fishing. We're seeing Microsoft and Google start to experiment with undersea server farms because the server farms are generating so much heat, and now we're putting them into an already overheated ocean. And so those things are very pertinent to my other kind of research. But I think that that question of the morality of it is becoming more and more prevalent with our students, both from
Hmm.
the materialist position, and I talk about it not just from the materialist position, but also a new feminist materialist position. And that I'll be addressing a lot of that in this newer book that I'm working on, but also from a labor position. And I think that there are tie-ins to the labor consequences here as well. And I think we're going to have to think a lot more, not just in higher ed, but the overall labor consequences of AI integration. So no, I think that's a fantastic question. It's something I talk with every single group that I talk to about is that as well.
Yeah, let's stay with students a little bit and with learning. And you mentioned this earlier, it's something that I'm really interested in. And that's, playing with this notion that learning requires effort, right? Any improvement in performance, cognitive, physical, whatever, requires some effort. And, one of the fears that I hear is that these tools, alleviate, make it kind of effortless, like the magic button, right? Now, I know it's not a magic button, but can you reflect a little bit on the relationship between effort and learning and how these tools, where do we locate the effort, the human? You mentioned a little bit earlier, students want to do it themselves, right?
Right.
What I hear is students want to put in the effort to learn something or to learn how to do something better. How do you think about that effort learning AI matrix?
Yeah. So, I mean, the first thing I want to throw out there, because I've been thinking about this a lot, is I also worry that in all these conversations, and I'm borrowing this, and I'm blanking on my colleague's name who did this. I heard her talk at a conference, and I've been trying to expand on this. That we've made efficiency a value, and
Yeah.
to me, that's an interesting kind of question that we have to ask. But I think for me, the more interesting question that you're asking, Jeff, is it's not just about the learning, but it's a specific kind of contextual learning. And so I regularly hear that narrative of students are no longer learning how to do this. Well,
Right.
but they're learning to do other things. And so it's also a willingness to acknowledge that part of our defensiveness is a defense for a value that we've held in place for a very long time, but the context in which that value unfolds is changing. So it's not that the students are not learning things, they're not learning specific skill sets that were relevant in a different context. Now, in the humanities and in writing studies, we want to fall back to that on that position a little bit further and say, yeah, but this is how we teach critical thinking and problem solving and being a good human and being a good citizen. And my response to that is writing is not necessarily an inherent way to do that. There are other ways to do that. I
Right.
literally had a faculty member ask me at a conference I spoke at 2 weeks ago, well, if I'm not teaching the essay, how am I going to teach them critical thinking, problem solving, research? The genre doesn't matter. I said, by the way, where were you when Adam Banks 15 years ago told us to stop teaching the essay anyway, right? Um, I think that part of it is we don't want to step out of the context that we're comfortable in and identifying what the value of what we do has been, rather than thinking of what are the values of what we're going to do moving forward. So I still think that students are learning, they're going to learn different things. It's not that they're suddenly, that everybody becomes a character in Idiocracy. It's that new skill sets are being developed. And we've seen this with every single educational technology that has ever been developed, right? It's the same conversation. I mean, come on, this is Socrates, right? This is Plato saying, writing is going to kill memory. And,
Yeah.
it's part of our tradition of teaching, but we always want to fall back to what we're comfortable with. And so that's why I really focus a lot on not asking what do these tools help us do better that we've always done, but what are they going to help us do for what comes next?
Yeah. Yeah. So sneak preview to where we'll go before this is over. So I'm going to stay a little bit with students and pair it with some of my interests in what you talked about contextual and disciplinary. So if we look at the question of, from David working in an engineering college, asking to do some encourage AI use in engineering writing assignments, tying into ABET outcomes, very specific question about tools that are good for this.
So I may not be able to give you tools specifically, but you're asking a much bigger, important question there. So one of the things that I talk a lot about is, for a very long time, we have, in particular disciplines in higher ed, a lot of our curriculum is developed around industry standards. So I talk a lot about the transition from industry to curriculum. And I point to nursing, engineering, pharmacy, HVAC, automotive, nursing, all these disciplines where the curriculum are designed to credential students to work in those areas. Now, so I'm going to take a side turn here to get back to this, but we are all familiar with those narratives that we've heard our entire careers, that employers are looking for these skills from newly minted college grads. And the number one skill, what is it, Jeff, that they always ask for?
Communication.
There you go. Number one skill is always communication, particularly written communication skills.
Yep.
For a long time, the second level of that was either problem solving or teamwork. Well,
Yeah.
now when we look at those kind of surveys, the second thing is AI literacy. Because as more and more industries become dependent or integrating AI into their enterprise systems, then we're starting to see a need for newly minted college students to come in with the transferable skills in AI literacies. And the number one literacy skill that they're looking for is always data security. So
Right.
we're starting to see a shift in how industry is influencing curriculum. So when we're asking about the engineering writing, my first recommendation about tools, my first recommendation about curriculum development is look at your industry. What are the tools that are being used there? And so, what is being done with AI? And I point to, I was working with a very small 2-year school with a group of nursing instructors. And we developed a strategy because they don't have a research assignment. Most of them are not practitioners. They're in the classroom. And we talked specifically about find out where in the profession, the professional journals, the trade journals, where AI is being addressed there, and then ask how does that transfer back into curriculum. So in the engineering world, my first advice is what is being written in engineering? Is the content creation things like reports and proposals and technical kinds of communication? Are we talking about more marketing and sales kinds of things? And find out what tools are being used in those industries and then transfer that back. And again, like I said, though, we are seeing more and more platforms that are designed for academic writing. I also think this changes how we think about transferability as well.
Yeah.
It puts a bigger emphasis on the learning how to learn, on lifelong learning. And this affects faculty development too, because It's not a matter of we're going to do 2 tutorials on how to use Microsoft Word and then I don't want to see you again. We're going to give you, some training and professionalization in, logic of AI, of writing for the bot, or being able to move from one platform to the next platform. And so it changes a lot of that as well.
So that's a great segue to a question I wanted. I wanted to get to the staff side. I wrote this down too, but we have a question about why institutions aren't putting in resources into faculty development. I don't know whether whether it's that they're not putting them. I don't know whether they know what to do. So let's pair that with what should that look like?
Yeah, so the what should it look like? Again, the place that I begin that answer is always look at your institution's mission. That's where you have to start that question. The training needs to focus on what your institution sees as its mission. I think that that occurs not just for faculty development, I think that occurs for staff development as well. Now, with staff, of course, we can have that now becoming very familiar conversation about the ways that AI and Gen Tech are able to help alleviate some of the repetitive, mundane kinds of acts, but it also allows staff to start to think forward of different ways of doing things. I actually think that for the last year and a half, it's only been very recent that we've been able to start including staff and administration in the faculty development or in the AI literacy development conversations. So whenever anybody asks, where do we start? My first place is let's look at the mission of the institution. Once we see that, now we can start asking questions about programmatic mission, programmatic objectives. What are the things that you as a writing teacher actually need to know about bringing Gen AI and Gen Tech into your curriculum? I also very regularly emphasize that this isn't a matter of now all of a sudden everything you do in every class has to be AI. It goes back to what are the missions that you have in your classroom? What are your objectives? And I'm going to add a note here if you'll let me, because I think it's important. I try to make sure that this is clear in every talk, every consultancy, every group that I meet with. One of the things we have to be very careful about in these conversations is not to create a culture of obsolescence that ostracizes those faculty who don't want to participate in the conversation or don't want to bring these technologies into their classroom. These are faculty who have done great things for their students. These are faculty who've done great things for the institution in program development and mentoring and just about everything else. And we don't want to create a situation where those faculty begin to feel like they're being pushed out because these technologies don't answer their teaching mission. Now, in the same breath, we have to say this will happen culturally anyway. We're already seeing it. I don't know, about the different institutions you all work at, but if you go to at University of Florida, our students have a very robust conversation on Reddit. And you do every now and then see those comments about don't take this person, they don't allow for AI use, and you're not going to learn how to use AI in this situation. Those things will eventually happen. And we do have demographics showing that a lot of the resistance is a chronological, generational kind of thing. I won't get it exactly right. It's actually the epigraph for my new book. I love the Douglas Adams quote where he says, and it's not from Hitchhikers or from Dirk Gently, it's from the Salmon book, and I'm blanking again, fishing. But where he says, all technology that was invented from the time before you were born until you were 13 is natural in the way the world should be. Any technology that is developed between the time you are 13 and 35 is cool and exciting, and any technology that comes along after you're 30, 35 is terrifying and going to destroy the world. And
Yeah.
I do think there's, something to be said for how we respond generationally to this.
Yeah. So let's stay here for a minute longer. So if we think about, I think one of the worries about, so I'll just locate it at the University of Leeds. We need to catch up with our development programs for people. And one of the struggles that we have is we don't have a lot of people who feel like they know what to do, right? But it seems to me that there are some fundamental things, there are some patterns to what good development, faculty and staff development would look like. given that there's different kinds of tool sets. These things are moving so fast in some cases, but maybe not really. So where I'm coming to is, if you had to sketch out on the fly what the fundamentals of a faculty and staff development program would be, what would that look like?
Yeah, so before I give you that specific list, as it were, I did hear, and I've been thinking more about this in terms of AI development and AI deployment, that we're actually at this interesting phase, much akin to right after um, a lot of the early development of electricity was being put into play. And we're actually not seeing a lot of development in terms of what AI is, but we're seeing lots of development in AI deployment. So the technologies themselves are not moving as fast as they had been. What's moving fast are the platforms and the context in which this is being deployed. So that contributes a lot to that notion of velocity.
Right.
And the notion of velocity also makes it difficult because even though, like I said, we're seeing about 1,000 new platforms a week being launched, I tried to track this for a little while. You can't do it because a platform comes in and then it vanishes or it's bought out. And so finding consistent platforms is a more difficult kind of thing, which brings in a whole other question of capital and control over the system. But we won't get there yet. But I think that where the faculty development programs or the staff development programs have to start are with some basic concepts of what's being called AI literacy. Now, interestingly, when we start to list out what those AI literacies are, they don't always marry up with the same list of AI literacies that industry is talking about.
Yeah.
That for higher ed, there's a different kind of approach. But even in that, just understanding some of the basic conventions. One of the things that I talk a lot about is even in our conversation, Jeff, as we're talking today, we create a homology of understanding AI as this thing, right? It's not. It's a
Mhm.
whole lot of different things that we have
Right.
conveniently put under this one umbrella. So even beginning there with getting faculty to understand what these different things are, what machine learning is, what natural language processing is, what an LLM is, how it works, all those different kinds of just fundamental understanding of what that term means starts to move in that direction. In fact, I'll be giving a talk in January to kick off a 16-week long AI faculty development program. And so I'll talk about a lot of those things. But the other thing that I talk a lot about is just getting a better sense of across disciplines, what are the attitudes? Why is
Yeah.
it that biomedics is very eager to bring this in, whereas the humanities are much more resistant? So let's talk about why that is there. And then, like any other kind of tool, I want them to get hands dirty with tools. I do a lot of workshops, and my AI and writing textbook, we're in revisions for the second edition. And the number one thing that reviewers want are more hands-on things to do. So I think that a lot of it is experiential learning, and not just with our students, but with those who are bringing these tools into the classroom. That's sort of where I start that whole process.
Yeah, you kind of have to fold this. You have to practice, right? Like a lot of things, and you have to practice a fair amount in order to test whether the whatever the tool is makes a difference in what the difference that it makes in one's workflow.
Yep. I'm looking at this question in the Q&A from Timothy Cornelius. Yeah, I see. I see a lot of business schools using entrepreneurial tools. I in fact, took the AI. I've done a couple of AI certifications through the MIT process for that, and I've seen what they're doing with that. And yes, we're seeing more and more of that. Again, the deployment there is really happening more so at the bigger programs where there are a lot of resources available. less so at some of the smaller schools. I was talking with one of the people from Wharton School the other day about their deployment and starting to look at entrepreneurship and things like that. So yes, we are seeing more of that. And I think, in that question, that again, that leads toward that question of hands-on experience. The big problem becomes, how do you put these tools in faculty, in students' hands? Because now, once you start doing that, there's a whole host of questions. So when I do a workshop, the first thing that I ask is, how many of you have asked your students to do something, say, with ChatGPT? And about half of them will raise their hand. And my first question is, what have you done about privacy and compliance?
Yeah.
And the general response is, what are you talking about? And when I walk them through privacy statements and I talk about these things, and we talk about IP and we talk about personal information, and that's where some of these ethical questions come up. How then, or this is what, for me, one of the big interesting questions we have to face now is, how are we going to address things like access, bias, compliance, all of the sort of ethical questions when different disciplines need different platforms?
Right.
Or let's say, for instance, Jeff, you decide in one of your classes that there's a platform that you want to use that nobody else on campus has heard before. What are the processes for doing that? I'm also been asking, can we start assigning platforms and platform fees the same way we've done textbooks? Because in a lot of ways, it's the same thing. I want
Yeah.
you to learn how to use this thing. So rather than buying a textbook, I want you to buy a platform, and we're going to dig into this platform over the semester. Well, here at UF, that would take me 6 months to do, just getting through compliance approval, right?
Exactly. Yeah, yeah. Well, so let's stay there. And I do want to get to the research question we have in front of us. And if we have time, I want to get to the big conceptual question. But one of the things about the UK, which is really interesting and very different from the US, is if we're going to use AI and it's part of our instructional tool set, there is an expectation that we provide it to students on grounds of equity. And you mentioned, Florida is investing massive sums and has a donor who's willing to invest in them. So what do you think about? There's vast inequities at the institutional level in terms of what institutions are capable of providing. That resolves itself into vast individual inequities. At some level, they're not resolvable. But what do you think about broad gulfs? And this could be a big differentiator in terms of the student experience in the UK and the US, and that might drive enrollments. There's all sorts of things associated with
Right.
it.
And it's going to get worse. And here's why. And I'm actually, when we get done, I'm going to finish working on a piece that I'm writing about this now. So those inequities are not just about what platforms do people have access to. They are also about things like bandwidth. So for instance, here in the US, we have to keep in mind that broad swaths of Appalachia, Southwest US, most people don't have access to broadband in their neighborhoods like they do in the Northeast. And so even if we're providing platforms, unless a student is on campus using institutional resources, there's a good chance they're not going to be able to go home and use these platforms. And of course, we can make the easy example. That's the difference also between that example I gave of using ChatGPT to write an essay about Moby Dick. That's going to give a really crappy response, but it's free. And in fact, let's be honest, we're not having this conversation if ChatGPT had not been free from the outset. If this had been proprietary from the beginning, it would be a very different conversation. But take that student who can only access ChatGPT to write the essay about Moby Dick versus a student who can afford a proprietary platform that, let's say, the LLM is made up of only things from JSTOR or the Melville Society. Now we've got a very different kind of access issue also, and it creates that divide. Well, here's why it's going to get worse. So Trump has made very clear his intent to rescind Biden's AI executive order. And the focus of the AI executive order was on safety, on compliance and regulation. So if Trump does this, as he says he's going to do, that's going to push the compliance and the regulation down to the state level. And if he pushes it down to the state level, now and here, since we're going to head into research also, what happens if I am teaching and working at the University of Florida and I am collaborating with you at Leeds, and my AI regulations are different than your AI regulations, which are then very different from a funding agency's regulation? Or what effect does this have on recruiting international students where they're operating with an entirely different set of ethics and compliance? And what Biden's EO had done was to align US safety AI regulations with the European Union, G7, and some of the other big international sort of governing organizations. Well, now, if we're not operating with that, now we've got so many different kinds of compliance issues. I was looking at a piece yesterday. So far, 43 states, in anticipation of this, have started proposing legislation for state level monitoring of AI that is more about safety and ethics than at the federal level. Well, what happens when Florida and Michigan have entirely different state level regulations? So I think that that's one of the things that we've got to be looking very closely at. And like I said, it's sort of the front burner issue for me on what I'm writing about right now. But yeah, that's one of the big problems.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, at least in the US context, it probably follows a trajectory around the tax code, right? So states will reposition themselves as they do with the tax code for what they perceive to be certain kinds of competitive
Yep,
advantages. Yeah,
absolutely, absolutely, and also what industry is leading that state, right? You
exactly.
know, who are the legislators kowtowing to in their state? You know, when in Florida, the Big Sugar wants AI to do one thing, the tourist industry wants it to do another thing. Where are they gonna fall on all of that?
Yeah. Yeah. So real fast. So I don't want to, I want to give people a little break in case they're sandwiching this in between meetings, give you a little bit break, Sid, between what you have to do next. There is we may not get to the big conceptual question, although I might ask you to close on that. But for academics wanting to integrate AI into their research agendas, and now that depends on the discipline. There's widely varying versions of that. But maybe if we think about our own discipline, what advice do you have?
It's the advice. So I'm going to back up one step on that too. Everybody always wants me to offer what should the policies be about X, should Y, all of that. I'm opposed to blanket policies, and I'm also kind of opposed to a blanket answer about the research question, with one exception: transparency. That to me is the big indicator for how it's being brought into research. There are a lot of questions, of course, about where the research is targeted. It's a lot of questions about whether a funding agency supports AI in a particular way or not. I know that about a year ago, I think it was the NIH that had said they wouldn't look at proposals that were using AI to generate the proposal. But I also know, and I've been involved with one, that um, there are initiatives to use AI to try to drive funding agencies to different levels of efficiency in proposals and grants and things like that. So really the answer is to think about what the purpose of the integration is. So if it's just simply, revising something, that's very different than, I'll give you a case example. A buddy of mine who works in an engineering program was applying for federal funding, and in order for the proposal to meet the standards, he had to complete 20 proofs. And I don't know what engineering proofs look like, but it had taken him 2 months to write the first one. Well, he took that first one, used it as an example, and the AI generated the next 19 in 2 minutes. And he was just like, I could write a million grants every week. Um,
Mhm.
but the question of, will the funding agency accept those proofs, and how are you discussing how you did that? Because what really became the issue there was the methodology that the AI was using versus the methodology that he as a writer was using. And so that
Yeah,
became the interesting part of that. So I mean, these are such contextual questions,
they
and
are.
and they do fall also to sort of a personal decision of what's the purpose in me using this.
So let's close with this question, Sid. So let's go to I think these intelligences, if you'll allow me that phrase, really do really are going to force some bigger sort of questions of meaning. So
Absolutely.
let's think about that maybe in terms of writing. So, you know, what are these intelligences what kinds of big meaning questions are they going to force for those of us who think about writing and think about writing instruction?
Yeah, so I'm going to start there in one of Rhet Comp writing studies, more theoretical spaces. And it's the hardest thing for us to wrap our head around is I think these technologies throw into serious question our entrenched notion of the autonomous subject of agency and of the writer as agent. I think you're going to have to rethink. I mean, that is so hard for writing teachers. And we can, the first chapter of my new book is called Authenticity. It's all about whether or not this just disrupts the notion of the authentic voice, the authentic writer. That to me is the real big thing that this throws into question. And of course, for those of us who have been working in post process theory or in concepts of hyperreality, you know, that it sort of makes all of that very relevant again. I feel like I need to go back and write more
Literally
post.
material.
Right. All of a sudden, everything I wrote about post process is so much more relevant than when I wrote it in the 90s. Right. So, yeah, I think agency is going to be the big one because we do not want to let go of that notion of the autonomous subject, of the self. And let's face it, our discipline has been having arguments about the self for, the last 30, 40 years easily. And to me, that's the big one for us as writing scholars.
Yeah, we are hopelessly romantic at the end of the day, no matter how much we might not want to be. Yeah, I do think these are questions of agency. I really am interested in these. I think it's going to really force us to think a little bit about creativity more broadly and
Absolutely.
in a deep way. There's obviously some labor and work implications associated with this, but I also do think we get to start to think about I mentioned the phrase earlier. What does human augmented creativity and productivity really look like? And then, of course, I'll always return to, we have to start making these damn things.
Right.
And we as a field we circle through this making technology thing periodically. Bill and I circled through it in our own way, but we don't do it. And so we're always subject to it, and then we moan about it a little bit. So,
Yeah,
but
I was actually thinking the other day about the stuff you and Bill had done on machine grading when the discipline just exploded with the notion of machine grading. And you
yeah.
all like, wait a minute, hold on. Yeah,
Yeah, we're there again, aren't we? So, yeah. So, well, Sid, I do want to give you a break before the next hour starts. I do want to give our audience a break as well. We had a question about whether this is whether this will be shareable. So, if you're okay, Sid, we did record
absolutely.
it. We're happy to share it because I thought this was an exceptionally rich conversation. Sid, this I had high expectations for this. You exceeded my
Thanks, Bill.
expectations.
Jeff, sorry. Thanks, Jeff. You had me thinking about Bill, but
Yeah,
I,
no, no
I would
worries.
I would add to that too. Anyone in the audience, or feel free to reach out to me. I love having these conversations. Whether just one on one or with your committees or on your campus, whatever. Please feel free to reach out to me.
We'll do it. All right, Sid, it was great to see you again. Thanks for
Good to see
spending some
you.
time with us. It was generous of you.
Glad to do it.
All right, take it easy.
You
Bye,
too.
everyone.